morning. Nice to meet you.
Does this look MC? You said MC.
It's like the Rhinestone Cowboy. That song.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our Blue Team Roundup. We're here with our very special MC, Wolf. Wolf, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello. Thanks, everyone, for joining. This is going to be so much fun. So my name's Wolf Korlick. I am an advisory CISO by day, working with Duo Security. And by night, I'm a fierce proponent of the security community and really looking forward to the blue team here. You know, the blue team is fun, right? The blue team doesn't get enough play. I would argue that the blue team doesn't get enough play. But we'll see today that there are some fantastic activities going on in the blue team, some great innovations, some really exciting speakers. So we're going to have some killer content that's going to help us all up our games and hopefully give those red teamers a run for their money. Hopefully give them a little bit of a hard time.
Awesome. And if this is your first roundup or webcast with us, thank you so much for being here. We actually have a Discord server that we like to run our chats through when we do these. So we're going to be in the Wild West Hacking Fest Discord server in the live chat. That's the one with the little bullhead. And outside of today's event, the Discord server is also just a really great place to get to know other people in the community. We have a lot of other channels in there as well. We have a LinkedIn Connect. We have, I think there's a couple of career opportunity channels as well. So there's a lot of great stuff to check out in there. This is our pre-show banter half hour. So as we like to say, we show up early because you show up early, and then you'll show up early because we show up early. And it's that vicious cycle that we all love so much.
It's good. And Ryan, welcome. Welcome to pre-show banter. What's new in your world? I know Ryan is our green room guy today, and he's
yes. I'm on standby on another computer in the green room. But it's going to be a while, I guess, before I have my first person in there. More on that later, I think. But yeah, just figured I'd drop in, say hi to the herd nerders. There's a few of them in the chat today. There's one of them who's speaking today. And
awesome.
I'll say this. I'll make a little bit of a plug. We had a fun day with the nerd herders yesterday. We did a spontaneous BHIS newscast, and they all joined in with us, and it was a fun time. That's online on YouTube. It's on the BHIS YouTube, but we're all family, so I figured I'd throw that in there, and that's it. I'm gonna say that because of the nerd herders, and we're proud of those guys. They help us out a lot, and we want to show them support.
We do love our nerd herders. Miss Megan, you spend a lot of time with the nerd herders. Do you want to tell everybody what the nerd herding is all about?
Sure. So we talk about our community and our community support all the time here, but the nerd herders are definitely, they hold a special place with all of us. They come and help us with training, getting things, technical support, those kinds of things answered for our students. And they're just really people that have come to our events and just reached out and helped. We will, notice sometimes during training that a specific person is going above and beyond, obviously helping other students in class, whether it be webcasts or actual classes. And so we reach out to them and see if they want to join the Nerd Herders, which they actually came up with their own name, which we absolutely love. And they, again, they provide such tremendous support. We wouldn't be able to run, especially our Pay What You Can classes, without them.
And I just wanted to do a quick shout out to our sponsors for today's roundup. First of all, Open Security, PlexTrack, the Farsight Security, Guardicore, and of course, Black Hills and ACM, Black Hills Information Security and Active Countermeasures. Thank you again for your support of these webcasts. Again, we really appreciate you.
Well, it looks like we're getting close to time, Shelby.
We are. We're about a minute from the start time. Although our first presenter actually is not able to join us physically today, so we have a recording of them. But I will let Wolf take care of doing the introduction for them and all of that stuff, because I am not emceeing today. He is.
Well,
Just say
obviously,
go.
the jacket shows that he's the MC.
Yes. Yeah, he's the one with the sparkly jacket. So, all right. Someone on Discord whose name I am not going to say said Wolf's symmetrical colored facial hair is quite calming, and I can definitely agree to that.
Yes.
I doubt that's something you did on purpose, Wolf, but it's very nice.
Yeah, I'll take it. If I got to get old, at least I might as well get old being symmetrical.
Yes.
Symmetrically old. There's a
Very
new
cool.
album cover name.
Symmetrically old, yes.
All right, and we have hit the top of the hour, so I think it's about time to get started here. And Wolf, I will let you give the introduction for Alyssa while I get her video ready to play here.
All right. So once again, welcome to the Blue Team Roundup, right? The Blue Team, the defenders, those in the hot seat when things go sideways. And I think we all have more than a few stories we could share when things go sideways. We are the first and last line of defense, and this roundup is for us in the Blue Team. And we're going to be focusing today on the knowledge and tactics we need to succeed in our organizations when we're under fire. Now, one of the key ways to do that is to have the lingua franca, have the framework, have the ability to tell a story about what the bad guys are going to do so that we can put defenses in place. Defenses in depth sounds great, but deep compared to what, right? Deep where? Deep how? And that's why I'm really excited about Alyssa Miller and the talk we're about to watch, because threat modeling is really the key to that, right? Threat modeling is the story that we tell that says, here's how the adversaries will move in our environment, and here's how we, the Blue Team, can orchestrate prevention, detection, stop them, and catch them. However, threat modeling has long been very complicated. It's been very convoluted. It's been shrouded in the mist of history. And so last year, 2020, 15 security professionals, they got together and they released this threat modeling manifesto and really laid the groundwork for what threat modeling is going to look like in the 2020s. And again, I think as we go through the rest of the sessions today, you'll see that what the content we're going to hear now is exactly what we need to know when we're thinking about how to build defenses, we're thinking about how to do forensics, when we're thinking about where and when and how to patch our systems. So with that, if we got the video keyed up, let's welcome Alyssa virtually, and of course she's also in the Discord to answer questions and talk about this great concept of threat modeling.
Blue Teamers, it's Alyssa Miller. How are you all doing? I'm so excited to be here as part of the Roundup. We got lots of great stuff coming your way, but we are kicking it off talking about threat modeling. Ooh, there's a term that sparks a lot of interesting feelings in most people. So, before I get started though, a little bit about myself in case you don't know me. My name is Alyssa Miller. I'm a hacker, a researcher, and security advocate. What does that mean? Well, I've been a hacker all my life. I've been taking things apart, figuring out technology and how it works since my youngest days. As a researcher, I like digging into new and interesting technology to figure out how it works and to do better. That's just, again, that hacker mentality. But as an advocate, I like to get out into our community and talk to people. Hear what others' ideas are, share my ideas, challenge each other, see what we can do to get better. I am currently the Business Information Security Officer, or BISO, for S&P Global Ratings. That's what I do with my day job. It keeps me nice and busy. It gives me an opportunity really to try to shape the security strategy for a very large division of S&P Global. I'm also an author and a blogger. I'm currently working on my first book, a guide to help people get started in their careers in information security. I blog to my website, which you can see in the lower right-hand corner here. And, I try to stay active, again, in the community. And as part of that, I'm also the co-host of a podcast called The Uncommon Journey. And on that podcast, we like to highlight the unique stories of the various people across security, because we all seem to have our own interesting story for how we got here. So we like to share a lot of that, me and my co-hosts, Chloe Mustagi and Philip Wiley, who you may know as well. So let's dive in. Now, I mentioned this idea, the term threat modeling, oftentimes sparks fear or groans in people's minds. And there's probably a few good reasons why. When I say threat modeling to you, what comes into your mind? Maybe it's something like this, these data flow diagrams, where we seek to map out where all the data in our entire application or our entire system is going to flow. Maybe you think of something like Stride, this framework for classifying the various threats that we may identify to our systems. And we put them into these really technical categories of spoofing and tampering and repudiation. Maybe some of you, like me, have been in those epic conversations where you spend half an hour arguing over which category a threat fits into. And then we've got things like the PASTA methodology, which are also meant to make threat modeling easier by laying out a very specific methodology for how we go through the stages of threat modeling and put all this together. And then if we identify those threats, we got frameworks like DREAD. So maybe this is something that you're familiar with. Maybe it's something you used in threat modeling before. We're going to talk about, we're going to categorize just how serious these threats are in terms of their damage and reproducibility and exploitability, who is affected in terms of the users, and are these discoverable threats, and how do we detect them? All of this comes together. Maybe you've even leveraged something like OCTIVE, where we've got this process for how we go through threat modeling, and it lays it all out. And maybe even you've seen CAPAC, the taxonomy that tells us how to really categorize common threats and identify them more easily. Maybe you've even read this book. Everybody who knows threat modeling seems to have read this book. This is Adam Shostak's book, and it has stood the test of time, and it is still kind of considered the gold standard when it comes to threat modeling. But we have all these frameworks and processes and everything else, and as you look at them, they all kind of share one thing in common. And that's that idea that we need to have these well-defined system design. And threat modeling has always kind of been relegated to the design process, where we're leveraging all of our knowledge, we're bringing everything together, we're going to design the system and design security controls because we've got this threat model, and we plug all that together. But that kind of thinking is so 2008. Where does that date come from? 2008. Do you know what's special about 2008? It was in 2008 that this idea of DevOps came to life. Patrick Dubois, back in 2008, wrote this, started talking about how do we get developers and operations working together so that we can deploy software more easily from a developer's perspective. He saw how people were butting heads and wanted to make that world a little better. So we started moving down this path of DevOps. We started bringing operations and developers together. Development started happening on a faster pace. And throughout this, one of the things that was lost were these ideas of long design cycles where we would design out the entire system we were getting ready to implement. And instead, we moved into this continuous process where we are constantly coding and deploying our systems without that structured approach to system design necessarily. And as we got into DevOps and we started to push into things like CI/CD, and it only got even more fast-paced and more dynamic, and we lost even more of the focus on design cycles. So a lot of people will look at threat modeling and say, well, you know what? We simply can't do threat modeling in our DevOps paradigm. It just doesn't work because we don't do these big design cycles. And so that's been a challenge. And it's certainly one of the things that's really held back the adoption of threat modeling. Now, we've been talking about threat modeling in the security space for the better part of at least 15 years. But adoption still lags as we look at the many different security strategies and practices that we can add to a secure development lifecycle. Threat modeling is one of those that we don't do as often. Puppet and Circle CI in their 2019 State of DevOps report looked at the various practices that we do and their impact on the overall security posture of our software. So they looked at them in two aspects. As you see here on the y-axis, you've got the frequency with which the practices are conducted. And then on the x-axis, you have their relative importance in terms of strengthening security posture. So if we look in that upper left quadrant, the things that we do a lot of, but maybe don't have a lot of importance when it comes to security posture, you see a lot of those traditional security approaches. Things like static code analysis and penetration testing and dependency checkers, or SCA as we like to call it. But then look down in the lower right. Those practices that have the greatest impact on the security posture of our systems, and yet see the least amount of practice in terms of the frequency with which we conduct them. And what do we see out there farthest to the right with the greatest level of impact, and yet it's in one of the lowest levels of frequency? There it is. Threat modeling. That collaborative effort of security and developers and operations and other teams working together to understand a system and to understand the threats that it faces. So as I said, these practices don't get the level of adoption that we see with things like penetration testing and static source code analysis. And that, to me at least, that's bothersome. Threat modeling is something that has always held a passion for me. I've always thought of threat modeling as a crucial practice that we need to tackle in security, and yet we don't see a lot of it. And so as I started to look at this, after having numerous conversations with developers about why they didn't feel they could threat model in CI/CD and DevOps in particular, I got to this point where I was like, I really felt like we needed to get back to basic. We needed to look at threat modeling in a new way. Threat modeling had been this thing that everybody regarded as heavyweight and just too much effort and it's just too time consuming to fit into our modern day development cycles. So when we want to get back to basics, how do you do that? How do we get back to basics and ask some simple questions? First of all, let's just ask the question, what is threat modeling in the first place? Seems like it should be a simple answer, but as we're going to see in a minute, maybe not. And then second, why do we threat model? What's the point of doing this? Why is it that threat modeling is so crucial? Why is it that threat modeling has such a just powerful impact on our security posture of these systems? There are very good reasons why threat modeling not only is important from a security perspective, but it can actually help speed up our development pipeline. So we're going to dive into that. And we're going to start by looking at the simple question of what is threat modeling. When I asked that question, I thought, well, I'll just Google it. I'll go out there and I'm going to find an answer. Well, really quickly, what I found was there was no generally accepted answer for what even is threat modeling. So I started with OWASP. We all love OWASP. especially when it comes to anything application security related, OWASP is our source. They're the ones that tell us everything about open web application security. Oh my gosh. And yet look at this definition. Read it to yourself. I'm not even going to read it to you because it's so lengthy. And it's complex. And so for someone, when I'm trying to explain to them what threat modeling is, to try to take a definition like this and use this to describe what threat modeling is in an effort to try to get to the point of why is threat modeling so important, this doesn't tend to be very helpful. It's very convoluted. It talks about things like denial of service attacks and failure of storage devices and all. This is not going to be the answer that's going to bring us back to basic. It's complex, it's difficult to read, it doesn't help us. So I decided to move on. We all like Wikipedia, don't we? I mean, if we see the answer on Wikipedia, it's got to be true, right? Everything's peer-reviewed, and we know they have all those editors working hard every day to make sure that all the information on Wikipedia is 100% accurate. Okay. And sarcasm. This definition isn't any better, right? It's maybe a little shorter, but it's still convoluted, talking about attack vectors and assets and an attacker's profile and asking when am I most vulnerable to attack and how do I know what are the most relevant threats and safeguard against these threats. Great, this is all really good information. But if I'm trying to get back to basics, this doesn't give me an answer that is useful. It's still complex. And when you start to read through this and you start seeing all these answers, you start to realize, well, no wonder people don't do threat modeling. They can't even understand what it is. All right, so OWASP didn't help much. Wikipedia, great information, still didn't help. Didn't get us back to those basics, still too complex. So I'm gonna move on. What about Microsoft? I mentioned Adam Shostak's book before, right? That was, well, he was part of Microsoft, and Microsoft has done a lot in terms of threat modeling. If you're familiar with the software development lifecycle, or secure development lifecycle, excuse me. So what does Microsoft have to say? Well, this now gets a little bit better. First of all, we can see physically it's just shorter. It's fewer words, which is always great. And in Microsoft's eyes, it's an engineering technique you can use to help you identify threats, attacks, vulnerabilities, and countermeasures that would affect your application. You can use threat modeling to shape your application's design, meet your company's security objectives, and reduce your risk. That sounds great. But is that accurate? Is threat modeling really an engineering technique? Is threat modeling exclusive to just application? Can't we apply threat modeling to various areas of our life? Doesn't it apply more than to just technological systems? Don't we have more people involved than just engineers? It's not just an engineering technique. So I'm looking at this one and I'm saying, you know what? Here's another attempt to define what threat modeling is that just seems to really miss the boat. It's not helpful. If we look at threat modeling as an engineering technique, that really narrows the focus of what we're trying to do. And the reality is, as we'll see in a little bit, threat modeling is a much wider practice than just engineering. Threat modeling applies to so much more than application. Even within IT, it can apply to systems. It can apply to infrastructure, it can apply to networks. It is so much bigger than just looking at an application. So while we always think of threat modeling in terms of application security, threat modeling is something that has far wider implications that we need to be concerned with. So I'm still trying to get back to basics here. How do I come up with a simple term or a simple definition that's going to describe threat modeling that anybody can understand? If I'm telling you that threat modeling applies to our very lives, that we could do every day in our lives, and threat modeling is so much wider and it's not an engineering practice, well, how do I define threat modeling in a way that isn't so technical that only engineers can understand it? How do I define threat modeling in a way that anybody can understand it. From the business people to any person I pick off the street who maybe has no IT experience at all. How do I define threat modeling in a way that they can understand it? If I bring threat modeling back to its most simple definition, I really get back to basics. I make threat modeling something that even a kid can understand. Threat modeling is simply asking a singular question. What could possibly go wrong? That's all it is. If I think about my daily life, forget about IT for a minute, and I'm going to talk about how do I threat model every day in my life. I'm going to go down to the city and I'm going to be in some neighborhood somewhere that is known for a high crime rate. I'm going to think about that before I do it, aren't I? I'm probably going to think about what are the things that could go wrong. I'm going to think about how do I react to those things and what can I do to make sure that I'm going to be safe. If it's a high crime area, there's a chance I could get robbed. There's a chance I could get mugged. So do I take somebody with me? Do I maybe avoid that area altogether? Do I make sure that I know exactly where I'm going to park and I have a very specific path that I'm going to follow to get from where I park my car to where I'm going? That's threat modeling. We do it every day. It's inherent to our human condition. But somehow when we get to IT, it becomes this big complex thing that we need all of these different frameworks and things in order to accomplish. Why? Because we don't take things back to basics. So when it came to defining threat modeling within the terms of IT, within the context of a security practitioner trying to explain this to the people within my organization, I needed a definition that worked. Try this one. Threat modeling is nothing more than identifying the likely threats to a system to inform the design of security countermeasures. Where did I find that one? Well, I had to come up with it myself. This was 2 years ago. But this is the reality of what threat modeling is in terms of, again, the context of IT. It's looking at any system and saying, what are the likely threats that this system faces, and what can I do about those threats? How can I design security countermeasures in my network, in my software, in my cloud environment that are going to help prevent those likely threats? So threat modeling is really just sitting down and doing this in a more formal way. We already tend to think about this, at least as security practitioners. If we're deploying a new system, if we're installing new technology, we kind of think about this anyway. But threat modeling is putting this into a formal practice where we identify these threats. So as I said, I came up with this about 2 years ago. This was the definition I was using when I talked to people about threat modeling. Then last year, 2020, June, I was asked to be part of a group of 15 security practitioners, all of whom have a passion for threat modeling. And we wrote the Threat Modeling Manifesto. The goal of the Threat Modeling Manifesto was the same goal that I had had for a couple of years of returning to the basics, to getting back to the heart of what even is threat modeling and why do we do it? What are the practices and the values that make threat modeling successful? What are patterns and anti-patterns of good and not so effective threat modeling? How do we achieve strong threat modeling in our organizations? And in November of last year, we published that manifesto. You see the URL here. I encourage you to check it out. And the definition that we came up with in that manifesto, it's not a lot different from mine, is it? Threat modeling is analyzing representations of a system to highlight concerns about security and privacy characteristics. Again, it's a formal approach to looking at some representation of a system, be it a drawing, be it user stories, be it whatever. However you want to look at a system, and highlighting where those concerns are from a security and a privacy perspective. So again, this falls within the scope of IT, right? This isn't, well, threat modeling applies at a grander level. This really, again, keeps us focused on information technology, on the things that we deal with on a daily basis. So as we start to think about threat modeling in terms of the basics and getting back to the basics, this is the definition we want to work from. This is the definition that reminds us, okay, regardless of how we do it, regardless of what processes, what methodologies, what frameworks we leverage, this is what threat modeling should be all about. Great. But now why? Why do we threat model? Everybody talks about it. You heard me say it. Threat modeling is crucial to the security posture. You saw the results of that Puppet and Circle CI report showing how important threat modeling is. But why? What is it? What do we get from threat modeling that makes it so important? The output of a threat model informs the decisions that you might make in subsequent design, development, testing, and post-deployment phases. Well, what do I mean by that? What did we mean when we said this in the threat modeling manifesto? What we mean is that when you do threat modeling early on in your development pipeline, it arms you with the knowledge that you need through the various subsequent phases. If you have design, and design might be in a CI/CD perspective, it might just be a developer taking a user story and thinking about how they're going to code it. But they can internalize that information. So if you have threat modeling information in that user story for that developer, when they take it and they start to build it, they can take that knowledge and think in terms of, how am I going to design countermeasures for this? And as they start to build it, they can develop that into their code. As we move into testing, having that information available to us can help us automate our test cases, prioritize our test cases, be better, more effective, having this information early in the pipeline. It helps us make that pipeline faster. So as we're talking to developers and business people and operations folks, all who are involved in our DevOps pipeline, about why we want to do threat modeling, this is why. Because having that information early on is the ultimate in push left strategy. And that security thing that we're asking them to do now actually makes their development easier and faster. It makes post-deployment easier because we know the threats now. We've got those, we automate our test cases, and we use all that information to automate post-deployment monitoring. This is the value of threat modeling. Threat modeling sets us off on the right foot from the very beginning. It's so much more effective than simply running some comprehensive pen test or static code analysis and hoping that we're going to find all the various permutations of insecure coding practices and pull those out. No, threat modeling tells us from the very beginning, these are the things you need to be the most concerned with, because these are the things that are going to impact your system the most. And now with that, armed with that knowledge, you can start to build countermeasures to address those threats. So this is how the Threat Modeling Manifesto talks about threat modeling. What we didn't talk about in the Threat Modeling Manifesto is how to build a methodology. We didn't focus on that. Because in the end, each organization needs to focus on building their own methodology. We saw all those frameworks and methodologies, things like PASTA and STRIDE and DREAD and all of these things, OCTIVE, they all come together because everybody looks at threat modeling just a little bit differently. It can be used for so many different purposes. Just as we have varying approaches to DevOps and CI/CD, it's important that we have varying approaches to how we threat model. So when we talk in the threat modeling manifesto, we chose to focus on values and practices. What are the values that make threat modeling successful? What are the practices and patterns that make threat modeling successful? What are the anti-patterns that are common things we fall into in terms of threat modeling that threaten to make us less successful? So that's how we approach it in the threat modeling manifesto. Now, there are 5 sets of values that we talk about that I'm going to walk you through now to really help you understand how to do threat modeling in a way that will be most effective. Our first value is we value a culture of finding and fixing design issues over checkbox compliance. I saw this image and it was a perfect representation of this. Here you have a parking lot that has a handicap spot that's required for compliance. Anytime you build a parking lot outside of any place of public accommodation, you need to have parking for disabled individuals. Does this fix the problem? Does this address the issue? Of course not. No one can park there, right? We see the same thing when it comes to threat modeling. So often, threat modeling is done as a part of our compliance. We know we want to push left, so we take threat modeling and we implement it as part of our development lifecycle, and it's just something we do. We do it at the beginning, and it's one of the motions that we go through. But if threat modeling isn't really focused, if the priority of our threat modeling is just checking that box and making sure that we create all the diagrams and other things that are part of our methodology, instead of being focused on identifying potential design issues, identifying potential threats that we need to accommodate within our designs, then threat modeling doesn't do us any good. We can draw the data flow diagrams and attack trees and other things that we want. We're not going to get any better if we're not focused on fixing design issues, finding the threats and making sure that we design the countermeasures for them. So our first value, it's all about making sure that this is our priority. And you notice it says building it as a culture. That's because we need to have everybody involved, from the business to our engineering teams. Everybody needs to be involved in threat modeling. It needs to be a culture in our organizations that we work toward, that we build, that everybody understands this idea of what threat modeling is and how we use it. And to that end, our second value, people and collaboration over process, methodologies, and tools. You saw in that report early on from Circle CI and Puppet how it talked about threat modeling in terms of being a collaborative effort. One of the key learnings that comes from threat modeling happens as a result of having that collaboration between people, having the perspectives of the folks in our business line, having the perspectives of the engineers, having the perspectives of the security people, having the perspectives of our operations teams, all together talking about the same system and the very aspects of that system so that we can understand the threats from each perspective. If we're so focused on the processes and methodologies and tools that we use that we become so specialized that only 1 or 2 people are involved in this process, we lose the value. We lose that ability to identify the issues. We lose context that is so important in being able to see the system that we're threat modeling from a holistic perspective and to understand threats that maybe are outside of our own preconceptions. So it's crucial that we involve people and that we focus on this collaboration. people sitting down, many of you, if you do threat modeling already, you probably do sit down and have those large meetings where you bring people together and you discuss, maybe you lay out the data flow diagrams, maybe you draw network diagrams, maybe you go through attack trees and talk through them. That's good. That's a component that we want to hang on to, but we need to be more efficient about it. But we cannot lose focus on the people. The people are what drive threat modeling more than anything else. Processes, methodologies, tools, they're there to help us. They're there to guide us. But our focus needs to be on bringing people together to work on and identify these issues. Value number 3. Threat modeling, we value a journey of understanding over a security or privacy snapshot. What do I mean by this? A journey of understanding. It means that you're not just done because you threat modeled one. You did a threat model, great, okay. That's a snapshot, that's a point in time. But the reality is, you have many lessons to learn. You're going to conduct threat modeling, you're going to create some type of deliverable most likely. Whether it's information that you plug into a user story or a big report or whatever it is in between. But the reality is, after you've done that, you're not done. That's just the first step. You're going to implement controls and countermeasures based on what you found. That's great. But then you're going to discover that some of those didn't work. You're going to discover that you missed certain threats, things that weren't accounted for in your design. And so threat modeling needs to be this journey of understanding. It's not just about creating this snapshot of here's what our security looks like today based on the design as we understand it. No, it's building that overall understanding across the organization. Remember, we talked about this culture. We talked about how important people are. That journey of understanding so that everybody within the organization understands the threats that that system faces from a business perspective, from a technological perspective, from a financial perspective. Those are all the various risks that we have within our organization. We need to understand them all because we have threats that we face. And so we are building this journey of understanding in which everybody in the organization is slowly learning new lessons and slowly developing a greater knowledge of the threats that each system faces. That's where threat modeling has this just poignant impact on our security posture within the systems that we develop. And then, in threat modeling, we value doing threat modeling over talking about it. How many people do you know? How many organizations talk about the idea of doing threat modeling? But when it comes time to do it, it doesn't actually happen. This happens over and over again. We get to the door of that airplane, we're ready to jump, but we never take the step out the door. Threat modeling, we are far better served by diving in, stepping out of the plane and just taking that dive and starting to do it, than sitting there and talking about it and talking about how we're going to build methodologies and taking months and months and months to try to develop a process. The value in threat modeling comes from doing it. We're better served by diving in and just starting to do threat modeling than by talking about it. And our final value. Threat modeling values continuous refinement over a single delivery. We mentioned before that journey of understanding. Threat modeling needs to be something that we do over and over and over again. We continually make it better. We're not focused on delivering one perfect threat model that has everything documented and is the end-all be-all answer to all of our threats. That's never going to happen. It's not realistic. Technology changes all the time, and therefore the threats that we face change. So we need to be focused on continuous refinement, just like a sculptor is continuously refining their creations. You and I can look at it and say, boy, that thing looks like it's done, it's gorgeous, and yet there's always another piece that artist wants to correct, that they want to change. That's how we need to be about our threat models. So in the end, as we talk about building a methodology of threat modeling within our organizations, we go back to the Threat Modeling Manifesto for one more crucially important line. Threat modeling must align with an organization's development practices and follow design changes in iterations, that are each scoped to manageable portions of the system. In other words, our methodology has to fit how we work. It has to be manageable iterations that don't bog us down in trying to map out an entire system and understand the whole thing. So you've heard me mention user stories a bunch. Thinking about threat modeling just in the scope of one user story. We do our iterations within the user story. We do one threat model per user story, and we just scope it. That keeps things more manageable. Maybe within your organization, it's a sprint, and you threat model within the scope of a sprint. However it works in your organization best, it's got to align with how you function. That is crucial for making threat modeling work. It is how we become successful in this process. Keep your eye focused on this concept. Don't get bogged down in all of these various frameworks and methodologies that seek to confuse us and make things overwhelming. Instead, let's keep things simple. As I wrap up, I have one last quote for you, and this one comes from Albert Einstein. Genius is making complex ideas simple, not making simple ideas complex. I can't think of a better quote that applies to threat modeling than this. The genius of threat modeling is that we are taking these complex systems that we develop every day in technology, and we're making them simple to understand so that we can see the threats, we can react to them, we can develop countermeasures that are going to protect us. If our methodologies and our frameworks and our processes are so complex that they become overwhelming, we've taken the simple and we've made it complex. That's not the goal of threat modeling. So I invite you, please continue this conversation. I love talking about threat modeling. I love talking with people in the industry in general. You've got my information here, my Twitter handle. You see it probably 3 times on the screen right now. That's the easiest way to reach out to me. You've also got my LinkedIn information there. Happy to connect with you, and my website. I don't blog a lot, but when I do, it's usually some pretty decent stuff if I do say so myself, so check it out. But truly, connect with me. Let's talk more about how we can get better. And with that, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to the Roundup, the folks at Wild West Hackin Fest for having me as a part of this Blue Team Roundup. I want to say thank you to my employer, S&P Global Ratings, for making it possible for me to be here today. And of course, from the bottom of my heart, thank you to all of you for coming and attending and checking this out and being a part of what we're doing here today and trying to make things better in our world as Blue Teamers. So keep these lessons in mind as you go through, and you're going to hear lots of great presentations the rest of the day today. Check them out and think about how you can focus on the basics. Take the complex and make it simple. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Take care.
That was such a good talk, Alyssa. Thank you. And there's been some great discussion in the Discord as well. Where does this fit? What frameworks? And one of the things that really jumped out and stuck with me was Alyssa's comment of the framework that makes sense, right? Because if you're doing threat modeling in part of a sprint, well, you better be using Stride or the framework your DevOps people use. If you're doing threat modeling for your SOC, well, you better be tying that up to the attack MITRE framework or a kill chain approach, so that when you hand it off to the SOC, that it really is impactful and that they can run down and hunt for those things. So just some fantastic questions in there.
Agreed, Wolf. And we're really glad Alyssa, I think, is hanging around in the Discord. answering questions. So, please feel free to direct your questions over there. If you have any, I just wanted to jump on and again, thank Alyssa. Alyssa is also invited to come speak at Wild West Hackin Fest Way West in Reno. So we're hoping she accepts as well.